Welcome to Chapter 4, Tissue. Throughout this PowerPoint, we will address 11 lecture objectives and questions, but overall we will start by defining what a tissue is and move on to identify the 4 primary types found in the human body. From there, we will talk about the structure of each type of tissue as well as its function and where we find each type throughout the human body. We will finish up this lecture by talking about membranes and the 3 different types, as well as the process of tissue repair. If at any point in time you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. My email can be found on Canvas as well as throughout the other lecture PowerPoints. If you remember from Chapter 1, a tissue was a part of the structural organization of the human body. And in the simplest of terms, a tissue consists of a group of cells that are similar in their structure and or function. Throughout the human body, we find 4 different types or 4 primary tissue types: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. On this diagram, again, we see the 4 primary tissue types, as well as where they're found, maybe a little bit about their function, but overall nervous tissue will be found in the nervous system, the brain, spinal cord, and nerves. Muscle tissue, we will actually see 3 different types of muscle tissue. Epithelial tissue, the best example is skin. And then lastly, connective tissue, which is comprised of your bones, your tendons, and blood is even considered a connective tissue. As we move throughout each primary tissue type, you will see that each tissue has its own function throughout the body, and they can often be found in several different forms. For starters, epithelium usually consists of a sheet of cells. Again, these cells are going to be similar in structure and function, but these ones are going to cover body surfaces or body cavities. Epithelial tissue can be found in 2 forms. The first that we will talk about is covering and lining epithelium. The best example of that form is the skin on the body. The second form is known as glandular epithelium, and as its name suggests, these cells forming this tissue will be found in glands, such as the salivary glands. Salivary glands produce saliva in the oral cavity or in the mouth. The main functions of epithelial tissue are there to protect the body. We will see absorption in the digestive system, filtration in the urinary system, as well as excretion, amongst others. Epithelial tissue has 5 distinguishing characteristics that truly set it aside from the other 3 primary tissue types. We will talk about each of these in great detail, starting with polarity, specialized contacts, the fact that these cells are supported by another tissue type known as connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is avascular, which means without blood supply. And then lastly, we will see how epithelial tissue has highly regenerative capabilities. The first distinguishing characteristic of epithelial tissue, and something that sets it aside from the other 3 primary tissue types, is its polarity. Meaning that it has sides and it has a top and a bottom. The top of epithelial tissue is known as the apical surface, and this is the upper free side. For example, your intestines are lined with epithelial tissue. The apical side of that tissue faces whatever is passing through your intestines, whether that's pizza that you had for lunch or coffee that you drank for breakfast. On the opposite side, we have the bottom or the basal surface. And this is the surface that is going to anchor the epithelial tissue to underlying structures. Epithelial tissue also exhibits specialized contacts, and this just means how do adjacent cells connect to each other on their sides. We will see two different types of lateral contact points. The first is known as a tight junction. You could think of this as lack of space between two cells. A tight junction will prevent the leakage of anything to pass in between those cells that are next to each other. Another type of lateral contact, again, remember lateral means to the side, is a desmosome. You could think of desmosome as a chain link fence or glue, and a desmosome is responsible for adhering or attaching neighboring cells to each other. Next, all epithelial sheets, no matter where you're looking in the body or what type you are looking at, all of them are supported by an underlying connective tissue sheet, and we will talk about different forms or types of connective tissue in just a bit. But we often refer to this underlying support as the basement membrane. The basement membrane is comprised of the basal lamina as well as the reticular lamina. Both of those are non-cellular sheets, mostly made up of glycoproteins and collagen fibers, and that is there to resist stretching and tearing. Epithelial tissue is avascular, but it is innervated. Avascular means without blood supply, so we will not see any blood vessels found in epithelial tissue. However, there are cells there. It is a living tissue, so it does require nutrition. Epithelial tissue will receive the necessary nutrition by diffusion, and that is from the underlying connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is innervated, meaning it has a nerve supply. When you touch the skin on the back of your hand, you know that you're doing that and you are able to feel it because of these nerve fibers. The last defining characteristic of epithelium or epithelial tissue is its highly regenerative capability. And that just means we are able to regenerate or create more cells that contribute to epithelial tissue. This regeneration is stimulated by either the loss of the top or the bottom of the tissue, or if neighboring cells and those lateral contacts are broken. You fall, you scrape your knee, it eventually scabs over, but then after a while you see that skin grow back to the way it once appeared. For the next portion of this lecture, we are going to just focus on covering and lining epithelium. We'll talk about glandular epithelium in a bit. But first, with covering and lining epithelium, we always name it. And just like a person, epithelial tissue will have a first name and a last name. The first name of the epithelium tells you the number of cell layers. Is it one layer of cells creating the sheet, or is it 4 layers of cells creating the sheet? If a epithelial sheet is a single layer thick, or you have a layer of just single cells, we call that simple epithelia. If an epithelial tissue sheet is more than 1 cell layer thick, we then call it stratified epithelia. The last name or the second name of epithelium will tell you the shape of the cells that are creating that epithelial tissue. We have 3 different shapes. The first is called a squamous cell. Those are flat and scale-like on a fish. The next shape is known as cuboidal. Like its name suggests, it's a cube or box-like. And then lastly, we have columnar cells. They are tall and column-like, like a skyscraper. Now, eventually we will begin to put first and last names together to create names for epithelium. But As we name stratified epithelium, again, many layers of cells thick. When we name the shape of the cell found in that sheet, we want to look at the cell towards the apical layer, just because the cells on the top are going to appear slightly different than the cells along the basal surface. So that is something to keep in mind as we name stratified epithelia. This image demonstrates classifying epithelium based on the number of cell layers. So again, that first name of epithelium will either be simple or stratified. Simple means that it is a single cell layer thick, and you can see that on the top. Stratified, meaning there are more than one cell layer thick. Again, when you are naming the shape of a stratified epithelium, you want to look at the cells towards the apical surface. And on this one, you can see that the cells along the apical surface are much flatter compared to the cells along the basal surface. This diagram shows you the second name of epithelia, again, where we name an epithelium based on the shape of the cell making up that tissue. We have squamous cells, which are flat and scale-like, cuboidal cells, which are cube or box shaped, and lastly, we have columnar cells, which are taller than they are wide, like a skyscraper or a high-rise building. Now we will begin to actually name epithelium using the first name and the last name. First, we will address a group of simple epithelium. Overall, simple epithelium will be found in areas of absorption, like the intestines, secretion, or involved in filtration processes, like found in capillaries or really small blood vessels. The first type of simple epithelium we will talk about is called simple squamous epithelium. And just by looking at that name, I know that it is a single layer of flat cells. This type of epithelium, since it's fairly thin, will be found in areas where we want diffusion, such as in the lungs, where we will diffuse oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, later on, when we talk about the cardiovascular system, we will see simple squamous epithelium again when it lines blood vessels and the inside of the heart. But to keep things simple, we will just call it endothelium. So when you see the term endothelium, you should automatically think simple squamous epithelium lining some sort of vessel or lining the heart. We also have another term, mesothelium. When you see that term mesothelium, you should automatically think simple squamous epithelium in the ventral body cavities, such as the abdominal cavity or the pelvic cavity. Still staying on the subject of simple epithelium, but again changing that second name or changing the shape of the cell, we have simple cuboidal epithelium. We won't talk too much about that. It's really only found in the ducts of glands as well as in the kidneys. And simple columnar epithelium, we will revisit this type when we talk about the respiratory system. But for the most part, simple columnar epithelium will usually have microvilli or cilia. And if you remember from the previous chapter, these are two types of cellular extensions. Microvilli are finger-like projections that are used to increase the surface area, which is great for absorption in the digestive system. And cilia are hair-like extensions that are going to sweep substances across the surface of the cell, like mucus that we will see in the respiratory system. This type of epithelium may look unfamiliar just because we never talked about its first name before, pseudostratified. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium is clumped together with simple epithelium because while it looks stratified, meaning it looks like it has many different layers, it truly only has one layer, And that's because all of the cells that make up this epithelium touch the basement membrane, making it a single layer of cells. But pseudostratified columnar epithelium is the type of epithelium which lines the respiratory tract. So inside of your nose, throughout your windpipe, and down into your lungs. Now, something to take away from all of these different types of epithelium: on your exam, I will most likely describe an epithelium to you. I could say that you're looking at a single layer of cube-shaped cells. What would we name this epithelium? And the answer would be simple cuboidal epithelium. Moving into the stratified epithelial tissues, again, that term stratified means more than one layer of cells. As we have many cells, again, epithelium has highly regenerative capabilities. So when a stratified epithelium is producing new cells, those cells come from the basal layers, or the bottom, and then migrate towards the apical surface. Stratified epithelium is great for protection, whether that's in areas of wear and tear or high abrasion. The first type that we will talk about is stratified squamous. Again, when you name an epithelial tissue that is stratified and you're trying to identify the shape of the cell, you want to look towards the apical surface. The apical surface will have a different cell shape compared to the basal layer. But stratified squamous epithelium, the best example is your skin. We have many layers of flat cells. We put it in areas of high wear and tear. Next, we have stratified cuboidal epithelium. The first two listed on this slide aren't as important as the ones that we have previously discussed, but we will find stratified cuboidal epithelium in areas like sweat glands as well as in the mammary glands. Stratified columnar epithelium, so many layers of cells with the apical layer having columnar shaped cells. This type is often found in the pharynx, so the back of your throat or the back of your nasal cavity, as well as in the malurethra. And again, only the apical layer exhibits that cell shape. And the last type of epithelium that we will talk about when it comes to covering and lining epithelium is transitional epithelium. It's named transitional because the cells change shape when the organ is stretched. You will only see transitional epithelium throughout the urinary system, so it lines organs such as the bladder, the ureters, and the urethra. Usually when the bladder is empty, these cells puff up. They look like umbrellas. And as the bladder begins to fill with urine, the bladder stretches and those cells begin to flatten out. So transitional epithelium found in the urinary system. Very briefly, the other form of epithelial tissue is known as glandular tissue. For starters, a gland, like your salivary gland or a lacrimal gland, which produces tears. No matter what gland you are talking about, it will consist of one or more cells that's going to produce and secrete a solution that we will just refer to as a secretion. This secretion can be hormones, it can be sweat, it can be saliva. We can continue to talk about glandular epithelium or classify glands based on where they release their secretion. Endocrine glands. Anytime you hear endocrine, you should automatically think hormone. We will not talk about endocrine glands in this course, however, you will see it in EXS217. Endocrine glands will secrete their product into the bloodstream or internally in the body. And again, a good example of a secretion is a hormone. Another type of gland is known as an exocrine gland. So it will secrete its contents or its production externally or onto the surface of the body. Sweat glands, as well as saliva or salivary glands, are exocrine glands. We will now move on to the second primary tissue type in the human body, known as connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most abundant type of primary tissue in the human body, and it is found almost everywhere. Overall, all the different types of connective tissue function to bind, whether that's binding bones together, support, protect, insulate, store energy or reserve fuel, as well as transport substances. Similar to epithelial tissue, we have subtypes or more classes of this primary tissue type. Remember, epithelium was broken down into lining and covering epithelium and glandular epithelium. Connective tissue now has four forms, or four main classes: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. Now, the four main classes of connective tissue all seem very different, especially blood. But they are all considered connective tissue because they have the three following elements: ground substance, fibers, and cells. The first two elements, ground substance and fibers, they can be put together to just be called the extracellular matrix. It's the stuff around the cells. And we will look at these three main elements when we talk about each class of connective tissue because they're all slightly different. Their composition as well as their arrangement will differ considerably as you look at the four main classes. We will first start by looking at each of these elements and seeing what they are composed of. The first one being the ground substance. This could be considered a colloid mixture. It's a gel-like material that's going to fill the spaces between cells. Other things that comprise ground substance, the majority of it is water. We will also see interstitial fluid, which is another name for tissue fluid. We will see certain adhesion proteins that are there to hold the cells of that tissue together. And lastly, we will see proteoglycans, such as chondroitin sulfate as well as hyaluronic acid. Those two are extremely important in cartilage health as well as ligaments and tendons. The next structural element of connective tissue will be the fibers. Remember, when you group together ground substance and fibers, you can collectively call it the extracellular matrix. We have three different types of tissue fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular. Collagen are the most abundant. They provide for tensile strength. Elastic fibers, if you think of a rubber band or an elastic hairband, these types of fibers allow for stretch and recoil, or stretching and returning back to its resting length. And lastly, reticular are very short or fine, and they offer a mesh network and they provide for give, kind of like a pillow. The last element of connective tissue will be the cells. We will have two different types of cells, the first being blast cells and the second being site cells. If a cell name has blast at the end of it, it usually means that it is an immature cell that is responsible for secreting the ground substance and fibers, or the extracellular matrix of that tissue. Now, depending on what class of connective tissue we're talking about, the first part of that cell name will change. For example, the first class of connective tissue was connective tissue proper. In connective tissue proper, we will have fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are immature cells that will produce the extracellular matrix for connective tissue proper. Next, we have chondroblasts. Chondroblasts are going to be immature cells that produce the extracellular matrix in cartilage. We also have osteoblasts, immature cells that are going to produce the extracellular matrix in bone. And then next, for blood, we have hematopoietic stem cells. Anything heme or hemato means blood. Hematopoietic stem cells are found in bone marrow, and they are going to give rise to all blood cells. Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The next type of cell that we will see is known as a cyte. We will see chondrocytes, osteocytes, erythrocytes. Anything with the term cyte in it is a mature cell that is simply there to maintain the extracellular matrix of that connective tissue. Again, we have 4 main classes of connective tissue listed on the screen: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. The next chunk of this lecture, we will go through each class. We will talk about its elements. We'll talk about their cells, their fibers, as well as their functions and where they are found throughout the body. We will first start by talking about connective tissue proper, which we will just write as CT proper. Connective tissue proper includes all connective tissue except bone, cartilage, and blood, aka the other 3 main classes of connective tissue. We have to continue to break it down. So connective tissue was a class of connective tissue proper was a class of connective tissue. Now we have 2 subclasses of connective tissue proper: loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. There are several different types of loose connective tissues and several different types of dense connective tissues. Listed on the screen, the 3 types of loose are areolar, adipose, and reticular. The 3 types of dense are dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Now what we will do is talk about those 6 types of connective tissue proper belonging to the 2 subclasses. We'll first start by talking about the 3 types of loose connective tissues, with the first being areolar connective tissue. You could think of this type as the packing peanuts of the human body. It's generally found between other tissues. It's there to provide support as well as to bind adjacent structures to each other. Again, this is a type of connective tissue proper, so it will contain fibroblasts. Remember, fibroblasts were an immature type of cell that's going to produce the extracellular matrix of connective tissue proper. The next type of loose connective tissue is adipose tissue, and if you are familiar with the term adipose, it means fat. There are 2 types of fat or adipose tissue in the human body: white fat and brown fat. White fat is the kind of fat that we usually think about. The cells that are found in adipose tissue are known as adipocytes. That tissue is highly vascularized, meaning it has a rich blood supply. It's great for shock absorption, insulation, and it's also good for storing energy in the form of lipids. Now, brown fat is more common in babies. However, you do find it typically anterior to the sternum or to the breastbone, as well as in between the scapula or your shoulder blades. And it is there to heat the bloodstream or to heat the body rather than to produce energy in the form of ATP. And the last type of loose connective tissue is known as reticular connective tissue. Again, reticular fibers are there to provide a mesh network that will offer some give. So reticular connective tissue is typically found in your lymph nodes, like in your neck, your spleen, as well as in bone marrow. Moving on to the three types of dense connective tissue. The first is dense regular connective tissue. For your exam, you should have a general idea of where we find this type of tissue. And dense regular connective tissue, for starters, makes up tendons and ligaments. It is poorly vascularized. If you've ever had an ACL tear or tendonitis, those two injuries do not typically heal well due to poor blood supply. But if you look at the image, you see that these fibers are running parallel to each other, which is where we get the name regular. You will not be shown a picture on your exam, but you should know the location of dense regular connective tissue. In addition to dense regular, we also have dense irregular, and as its name suggests, these collagen fibers are going to be irregularly arranged, and this is great because they provide for pull and tension in many different directions. We will see dense irregular connective tissue in the dermis, or helping to form the skin. We will find it in joint capsules like the shoulder joint, and we will also see it covering some organs in the digestive system. The last type of dense connective tissue is known as elastic connective tissue. If you recall, elastic fibers allow for stretch and recoil. We will see elastic connective tissue in the walls of arteries or very large blood vessels. These blood vessels expand or stretch when they fill with blood, and then they eventually recoil or return back to their resting shape when there is no blood in the vessel. The next type of connective tissue, so we are still on our second primary tissue type, connective tissue. We've talked about connective tissue proper. We are going to move on now to cartilage. When looking at cartilage, we have two cell types, chondroblasts, which are immature cells that are there to secrete the extracellular matrix, and we have chondrocytes, which are there to maintain the health of the extracellular matrix. Chondrocytes are trapped in little cavities or houses called lacuna. Think of these as shells. But the majority of cartilage is water. We also have some collagen fibers, and again, chondroitin sulfate and hyaluronic acid, which are two types of glycoproteins. If you have ever had a cartilage injury or even your ears pierced, they typically do not heal, or they don't heal very well, and that is because cartilage is avascular or without a blood supply. Again, with any other type of tissue, we have different forms or subclasses or classes. When looking at cartilage, we have three types. You need to know the three types as well as where they are found throughout the body. The first is hyaline cartilage. We will find this type of cartilage at the ends of long bones, like the bones of the thigh or the bones of the forearm. The tip of your nose is hyaline cartilage. Your trachea or your windpipe is also made up of hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage. We will find elastic cartilage in the ears as well as the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a leaf-shaped piece of cartilage found in the throat that will deflect food and water away from your windpipe. And the last type of cartilage is known as fibrocartilage. This type is great for compression. So we will see fibrocartilage creating intervertebral discs, or little pads in between your vertebrae or the bones of your spine. And the menisci of your knees are made up of fibrocartilage as well. Moving on to the third class of connective tissue, we'll talk about bone. Another name for bone is osseous tissue. We know that bones are there to support as well as protect, and we will talk about bone in greater detail when we get to the skeletal system. But for now, we have three different cell types. Osteoblast, there's that term blast again. It is an immature cell that will produce the extracellular matrix of bone because of the term osteo. Osteocytes are the mature cells of bone that are there to maintain the matrix. And then lastly, this is a cell with a part of its name that we have not seen before. But an osteoclast is there to break down bone or to resorb bone tissue. Bone is highly vascularized, meaning it has a rich blood supply. Oftentimes, people don't typically think of blood as a class of connective tissue, primarily due to the fact that it is a liquid. But it does contain all three elements of connective tissue. It has cells, which are surrounded by an extracellular matrix, which we will just call blood plasma. But overall, blood plasma will consist of ground substance as well as fibers. The different cell types found in blood are known as red blood cells or erythrocytes, white blood cells, which are known as leukocytes, and platelets, which are cell fragments used in blood clotting. The purpose of blood, and again, we will see this when we get to the cardiovascular system, is to transport or carry nutrients, wastes, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as other substances like hormones produced by endocrine glands. Moving on to the third primary tissue type of the human body, we have now talked about epithelial tissue, connective tissue. Now we are going to visit muscle tissue briefly. Muscle tissue is highly vascularized. It has a great blood supply. And no matter what type or what class of muscle tissue we are talking about, muscle tissue is responsible for movement. Usually when we hear movement, we just think of movement of our skeleton or of our body. But we have movement of air, movement of food, movement of blood, and all three types of muscle tissue allow for that. We have skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. For each of these types, you need to know where they are found throughout the body. The first type, and the most common one that we think about, is skeletal muscle tissue. It's named skeletal because it is attaching to our skeleton. When it contracts or when it shortens to generate force, it will move our bones. Examples of skeletal muscle tissue would be your biceps brachii, your quadriceps, or your hamstrings. All of the muscles that we are aware of, all of the ones that we exercise, are primarily skeletal muscle tissue. Instead of calling the cells of muscle tissue cells, we refer to them as muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are a great example of a multinucleated cell, meaning it contains many nuclei or many command centers. We also have conscious control over skeletal muscle tissue, so we can call it voluntary muscle. The second type of muscle tissue is known as cardiac muscle tissue. As its name suggests, we find cardiac muscle tissue only in the walls of the heart. When it contracts, it's going to force the movement of blood throughout the heart. It's different than skeletal muscle because, one, it's involuntary. We do not have conscious control over our cardiac muscle and when our heart beats. Also because cardiac muscle tissue contains cells that are uninucleated, meaning they only have one nucleus. And the last type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is found in the wall of hollow organs except for the heart. So examples could be your respiratory airways, the urinary bladder, and the digestive system. Smooth muscle tissue is also involuntary. We do not have conscious control over it. and the cells that make up this tissue are uninucleated. It's named smooth because it does not have striations or alternating bands of dark and light. The fourth and final primary tissue type of the human body is known as nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is the primary component of the nervous system, and if you recall from chapter 1, the nervous system included the brain, the spinal cord, and associated nerves. We will not visit the nervous system in this course, however, you will see it in EXS217. But this tissue, again, a tissue is a group of cells that are similar in structure and function. The two types of cells that we find creating this tissue are known as neurons or nerve cells and glial cells. You do not have to know their definitions for this course, but you should be familiar with their names. Now that we have addressed all four primary tissue types, epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue, we are now going to shift gears and talk about covering and lining membranes. We will talk about three types of membranes, but either way, they all consist of at least two primary tissue types. Remember your four, you have to know those for your exam, but usually a membrane will include a layer of epithelium or epithelial tissue, which is bound or connected to an underlying layer of connective tissue proper. Brief review, connective tissue proper is either loose or dense. Three types of membranes. We have cutaneous, mucous, and serous. Again, no matter which one you are talking about, we will see two primary tissue types, an epithelium and a connective tissue proper. The first type of membrane is known as a cutaneous membrane. The term cutaneous, you should automatically think skin. Skin is actually a membrane because it includes two primary tissue types. The first is the epithelium. More specifically, it is going to be keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. We will talk more about that in chapter 5 when we talk about the integumentary system. But we can simply refer to as keratinized stratified squamous epithelium as the epidermis. When you look down at the skin on your hand or on your thigh, you are looking at the epidermis. That layer of epithelium is attached to an underlying layer of connective tissue proper known as the dermis. The second type of membrane is known as a mucous membrane. You may also see these referred to as mucosa. However, mucous membranes will line body cavities that are open to the external environment or to the exterior, such as the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, and portions of the urogenital tract. And the third and final type of membrane, which we have talked about in chapter 1, is known as a serous membrane. Serous membranes are closed off to the exterior, and they are found lining ventral body cavities like the pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity and the abdominal cavity. The epithelium associated with a serous membrane lining these body cavities is a simple squamous epithelium. Now remember, we had a special term for a simple squamous epithelium in the ventral body cavities. It was mesothelium. That layer of mesothelium will rest on a layer of loose or areolar connective tissue. There is a cavity between these two layers that we will see filled with fluid to reduce friction, because serous membranes oftentimes surround organs that are highly mobile, like the lungs, the heart, and the digestive system. Very last part of this lecture, we will talk about tissue repair and the necessary steps. Now that we have talked about all 4 primary tissue types, let's find out what happens when we injure them. Overall, there are 2 options. Step 2, we have this series of organizational steps that will ultimately restore the blood supply. So that blood clot that we have formed in step 1 will be replaced with this tissue that is rich in capillaries or small blood vessels. Eventually, we begin to regenerate epithelium. Remember, epithelial tissue has a highly regenerative capability. And then lastly, we bring in fibroblasts. Fibroblasts are immature cells that are going to produce the extracellular matrix of connective tissue proper. We are going to use those fibers that we have produced to bridge the gap or to close off the injured area. Lastly, we are going to have that scab detach. The fibrous tissue will be replaced with epithelial tissue, and towards the end, we will see that tissue begin to resemble the tissue around it, and we will see the original function restored. Lastly, when talking about tissue repair, there is a whole spectrum of tissues that will repair extremely well. And then on the opposite end, we have tissues that once they're injured, there's no coming back from that. So examples of tissues that regenerate well: epithelium, bone, loose connective tissue, and some types of dense irregular connective tissue. Tissues with moderate capacity, so there is a chance that we will repair themselves and restore the original function: smooth muscle and dense regular connective tissue. And then lastly, like I mentioned, the 2 types of tissues with no functional capacity after they've been injured: cardiac muscle found in the heart and nervous tissue found in the brain and spinal cord. If at any point in time throughout this lecture you have questions, again, please do not hesitate to email me. It is johnsonml@uncw.edu.